Welcome everybody to our Exchange Cafe. We're trying to have these monthly. Last month, we had a presentation scheduled for general consumption, and we'll have our actual IW stuff in January. And probably because the timing, we probably won't have another cafe in February, and so we'll have another one in March. Tammy, why don't you go ahead and start?
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. Good to see the attendance here at our cafe. The Requirement Working Group had quite a busy year this year, 2021, and we're going to have an opportunity to view all that and understand where we are at the International Workshop that's coming up in January. So if you haven't checked yet, the INCOSE International Workshop for 2022 is a hybrid event where they recently sent out the announcement of what that meant. And it really is an opportunity to still use the platform if you're not attending the in-person event in Torrance. And you can see a lot of the recordings and maybe some participation real time in some of the meetings. But they are encouraging in person. And I know this year it's kind of hit or miss. I think we just had one conference that got deferred due to COVID. So I do expect they're still going to try and have the IW in person as a hybrid event. But for the Requirement Working Group, we were really happy with last year's event as an online platform, kind of like this. And so I wanted to do a little bit of both. What we agreed is we're going to do a pre-event, all virtual. And in fact, technically, it'll be just our regular Zoom set of meetings, but I'm going to hold a series of speakers. So I think you even have to register for the IW to attend our events. We're going to have them around the 25th and 26th of January. It's the middle of the work week. There are a couple days before IW. The INCOSE Technical Operations team did ask that I not hold them the day before IW because they wanted to allow people to attend our events and still travel. So we're going to have a couple-day event. We're going to have a series of guest speakers. I'm going to be coordinating them throughout the next month and a half on various topics and including an overview of where we are with our manual and our guides. And then at the event itself, I arranged for a meeting room on the Sunday afternoon at IW for an in-person opportunity for anybody actually going to the IW that wants to participate in a Requirement Working Group meeting. That will be on the IW agenda as like a Sunday afternoon event. It will be 2 hours. And I'll have a regular debrief of 2021 and what's going to happen for 2022, and just an opportunity for people to learn more about the Requirement Working Group and how to participate. It might be a good recruiting tool as well, but we are not going to really have guest speakers at that one. That will be more of a working group meeting, and we'll talk a little bit about our guides as well and what's left to do on those, and the manual should be published by then, and Lou, you could talk about that in a minute as well. For IW, we wanted to give people an opportunity to participate fully virtual, so if you can afford to take off if you work the 25th and 26th. That's when we're going to have a series of guest speakers. And what we'll do is we'll treat it like a Requirement Working Group meeting. We'll send out the notes, we'll send out the agenda, and we will let people see the recordings as well, which we'll post on our YouTube channel. I think that's it, Lou, for IW.
Tammy mentioned a little bit about our products. We had a good meeting with Tech Ops. They are happy with the manual. Since August, I've gotten several comments, and we're taking one last fresh look at it. Once we're happy with this version of it, we will send a copy to Tech Ops, and they'll post it in the INCOSE stores. What I'd like to do is get to know the people that are on. So could we go around and have everyone introduce themselves really quickly? We'll start with Carrie.
Carrie Brychek, Drama Software.
Hi, this is Gary Oswald from INCOSE Chicagoland. We're looking forward to commenting on the new products. Thanks.
Francesco Dazzi, President of the Italian chapter.
This is Craig from Dallas, Texas. Just joined INCOSE and just joined the working group. I attended today to find out what it is you're doing.
Oh, very good.
Hello, it's Pascal. I'm recently retired from Airbus. I am strongly motivated on requirement modeling topic and related action on V&V, requirement validation and design verification. So things a strong link with your product.
Yes, thank you.
Hello, this is Brad Burns from the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab in Maryland. I'm a systems engineer and doing a lot of requirements engineering lately.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Tammy Katz. I'm the chair of the Requirement Working Group. I work here with Lou Wheatcraft on this team, and I work at Ball Aerospace. Nice to see everybody.
And this is Al Meyer. I'm with the Atlanta chapter of INCOSE. For a short time, I'll be with Lockheed Martin. I'll be retiring at the end of the year from there, though, and I'll be starting with another company called SpaceWorks. So you'll probably see my contact information change.
And make sure that if your email changes to update it on the INCOSE site. So when we make announcements, we make the announcements through the membership for the requirement working groups on the website. So it pulls from whatever email addresses you have on record. Make sure in your preferences that you opt in to getting emails from the working groups and what they call committees so that you will get the announcements for all of our upcoming activities. In August, Raymond Wolfgang, one of our members and authors of one of the new products that we're developing, the Guide to Verification Validation, he was the speaker for the INCOSE August webinar, and he introduced our products. During his presentation, there was a lot of questions that were asked and just didn't have time to respond to all those in the webinar. So we were working through those questions the last two sessions. And I think we're going to be able to finish the last 5 or 6 in this session. For those that are new, the requirement working group, we have several products that are already published. The guide for writing requirements, as well as a white paper called Integrated Data as the Foundation of Systems Engineering, which advocates a data-centric practice of system engineering as what the real intent of MBSE is. We have 3 products that we're developing. One is the Needs Requirements Verification Validation Lifecycle Manual. It's quite comprehensive, about 470 pages, that talks about needs requirements, verification, validation across the lifecycle. Our feeling is that needs requirements, verification, validation are common threads that tie all lifecycle activities together. They're very dependent upon each other, and so they're all referenced in the manual. And then our philosophy is that people would also like to have maybe a more condensed version of guides that gives some more practical how, but also it's consistent with what's in the manual. And so you can go through the guides and get more concise description. If you want more underlying information, go to the manual. And so Tammy is the author, book manager for the Guide to Needs and Requirements. And that's roughly sections 4, 5, 6, and 7 of the manual. And then Raymond's doing the Guide to Verification Validation, which starts at design, verification, validation, goes through common aspects of both system verification validation, and then goes into the system verification validation parts of it. So it's really sections 8, 9, 10, 11 of the manual. The manual itself, like I said, has been approved for publish as soon as we finish our last round of fine tuning. And then Tammy and Raymond will finish up the guides, and then they'll go through their review cycles and published as well. A lot of what we're doing will require a realignment of the contents of the guide for writing requirements. So that'll be something that we'll be doing next year, also as starting an update to the guide for writing requirements. When we wrote the guide for writing requirements, there's some things we needed to communicate, but we didn't have any place to really document it, so we put it in the guide for writing requirements. Now, some of that information has been pulled into the manual, so the guide can focus just on the writing of needs and requirement statements. We've got a lot of good inputs on some improvements to that guide, so we'll be working on that. And anyone that wants to help, with any of these products, you're more than welcome to be a contributor, reviewer, whatever you have time to do. Before I go into the questions, I wanted to ask if anyone had any other questions they'd like to bring up to the working group before we start. Any issues you have, any comments on requirements or needs, problems you're having, question you'd like to ask before I get into the other questions in the webinar?
Maybe one question from my side, Pascal speaking. What about the coupling of requirements and verification with simulation means? Is it part of the scope of the working group?
Needs and requirements are the common thread across the life cycle. In the manual, there's a very strong emphasis on the use of various kinds of models as analysis tools to make sure our requirements are complete, consistent, correct. One thing that we're finding is the definition of what a model is. If you maintain your requirements in a requirement management tool, which has all the bells and whistles and features for doing a good job of managing your sets of needs and requirements and other artifacts across the lifecycle, if you're using language-based models that are part of the analysis is part of the discovery part of the needs and requirements, that's best done in the language-based modeling tools. And so what we're finding is there's vendors that have been very good at providing the glueware so that we can link the requirements that are in the requirement management tools to the requirement entities that are in the models. In that respect, then we can use the models to help validate the needs and requirements. Does that answer your question, or do you want to add a follow-on?
Okay, it's okay for me.
Anyone else have another question? The last set of questions that we have, I'll introduce each of the questions, and then what we'd like to do is have you all chime in, and whatever comments you have, anything you want to add, feel free to ask those questions. So the first one that we have, does the guide or manual cover anything on requirements analysis? That's an interesting question for several points. One is, historically, we've always talked about requirement analysis. That started with elicitation and all the way through, but the focus was on requirements. And the manual and a lot of what we're doing now, we're focusing on both needs and requirements. In the manual, section 4 is on needs analysis, and its title is Lifecycle Conception and Needs Definition. Approach that is advocated the manual is that we'll focus on a needs analysis first, so we understand the stakeholders' expectations for a system from the stakeholders' view of the system as a black box. So they'll state what they need from the system without worrying about what the system needs to do to make that happen. And we use models, diagrams as analysis tools to help mature our lifecycle concepts, then drive a set of needs based on that analysis. And then if we've done that underlying analysis using tools, diagrams, then the next step is transforming the needs into the requirements. So then that's where requirements analysis would come in, where for every need, we ask, what does the system need to do to meet the stakeholder need? So now we're switching perspectives from a stakeholder view to a systems or product view. So then the meaning of requirements analysis there is asking those questions. How do we define a well-formed set of system shell requirements that will result in the needs they're transformed from being met?
I have a question about that. So what about in the case where the stakeholder specifies some constraints on the system, and they could be very high level constraints, like for instance, the system must comply with IEEE standard XYZ, and it's actually imposing a requirement on the system, so it's not black box. The stakeholder is injecting that because they want some kind of consistency with standards.
A very good question. Even though someone may say this is a requirement, just saying that we want a standard be met is a very high level abstraction, and it's not really verifiable because there's still so many unanswered questions. And this is kind of new to people, but if you think about it, really is the stakeholder view. The stakeholder expects that the system will be compliant with certain standards. And like in medical devices, there's a whole list of standards. For aerospace, there's a list of standards. There's consumer safety standards that we all have to meet. And so the stakeholders expect the system to be compliant with that. In the approach of advocating the manual, that would be a stakeholder need, where the stakeholders need the system to comply with standard XYZ. At that level of abstraction, that's okay for a need. But now when you switch over, what does that mean to the system? Now you're going to have to look through that standard, which requirements actually apply to your system. And a lot of those requirements in the standard are written somewhat vague because they're not written for your product specifically, but for a class of products like yours. So then you're going to have to do some kind of a translation to saying, okay, what am I actually going to have to do to meet the intent of that requirement in that standard? And then that will be your system shell requirement. And we go into a lot of detail on this. Tammy's done a lot of research on it. And one of the things that may be better within your domain, you'll pretty well know ahead of time what standards are going to apply. So maybe your organization will develop your own set of standards to meet the intent of more ambiguous set of standards that applies, but your requirements are going to be very specific to your domain. And then they could be stored in a library in a requirement management tool. And then new projects come along, they can just take and use those standards and put those in their requirement set. And one other aspect, and it's really confusing, I think, the language we use. In 15288 in the System Engineering Handbook, we have a lifecycle technical process area called Stakeholder Needs and Requirements Definition Process. So that says there's stakeholder needs, the stakeholder requirements. Because it's the stakeholder needs and requirements, they think of that as a single thing instead of two different things and two different perspectives. And I was reading through 29148, the standard for requirements, and I found a phrase in there I thought was really interesting. It said stakeholder-owned system requirements. So if you take that and use that perspective as stakeholder needs and stakeholder-owned system requirements, now you're saying that the stakeholders, they're going to define needs from that stakeholder perspective, but they may also want to define define a set of system requirements that they own, but they reflect the system view. And so stakeholders could be the source of both the needs view as well as the requirements view. And so that's the approach that's in the manual, that you have both of those. We have multiple stakeholders that will have their own needs and requirements. So part of the process is we have to integrate all these different streams of needs and requirements, make sure that we have a feasible set of life cycle concepts to realize all those. There's going to be conflicts we have to resolve. And so that's why we spend a lot of time in section 4 just defining a set of integrated set of needs to represent all those different stakeholder viewpoints. Now, if you have a stakeholder that has a set of actual requirements that's going to be allocated to the system, then they should be reflected in the lifecycle concepts and needs. But then when you're going to write your system requirements, you will use those as a source. That'd be your parent requirements been allocated to your system. And then you can develop your system requirements and then as children that link to those allocated parent requirements. So the process is quite complex, but it's important to understand the needs and requirements instead of just the requirements. Any other comments? So a lot of work's in the requirement analysis part of it. In section 6, where it talks about the transformation of needs into requirements, it talks about the different classifications of requirements. We have functional performance. We don't use the function non-functional because it's too broad. It's also one of my pet peeves is that some people say that functional requirements are functional, performance requirements are non-functional. And so they have functional requirements and performance requirements as just separate things. But in reality, from a verification standpoint, it doesn't do any good to verify a function if you don't also verify performance attributes. For a requirement to really be verifiable, we talk about a functional / performance requirement and maybe a family of those for any given function, where for one function, you may define multiple performance factors. So then you'd have multiple functional performance requirements. Then we talk about form fit function approach. We have operational fit requirements. How does your system integrate into the macro system as part of? What are the physical attributes of it, the form? And then what are your quality attributes? And then what are your compliance? And so the way the manual is organized, you have those 5 different classes of requirements that go through, and we spend a lot of time describing that. And then a special form of functional requirement is an interface requirement. So there's a section on the interface requirements and defining attributes to go with each of the requirements, rationale, the owner, verification method, stuff like that. There's a section in there about, as part of the requirements analysis, how we can actually verify a system meets the requirements. We start our system verification when we're writing the actual requirement statements. So that's part of requirements analysis. And then we get rid of baseline, a set of requirements, say at the system level, but then requirements definition is done concurrently with architectural definition. And so we're going to end up with an architecture, and then we have to flow requirements down to the next level of architecture. So we call it allocation, but there's also budgeting. So performance, quality type things, physical attributes would have to be budgeted between the parts at the next level of the architecture. And then that continues until we make a buy, build, code decision. And so all of that's talked about, and it's very important that we establish traceability of all the artifacts across the life cycle. There's a section that talks a lot about that. So the whole chapter on defining what we call design input requirements is quite involved, but it assumes that we've done the needs analysis first. The next question, how are the system functions, behaviors, activities, sequence diagrams, use cases, user stories used to define system requirements? Is it function first, a good approach, rather than requirements first? So anyone want to comment on how they view this and what your views are? Requirements first, functions first?
Typical best practice is to derive requirements from use cases, for example, this for sure. This doesn't mean that necessary function first, but at least the description of use cases helps clearly to define the requirements. And also using CSML diagrams is a good idea.
Anyone else?
This is an interesting topic because it gets to a lot of conversations I've had with people about what do you do first? Well, there's this idea of iterations and recursive nature of the work. So I do believe that we do use cases and functions to generate requirements, but as we learn more, those requirements get decomposed further into functions, which then ultimately get decomposed further into more requirements. So I think there's a bit of a cyclical nature. But I do believe you do start with your use cases and what are your your needs, which get looked at in terms of what are your needed functions.
Be also connection with question number 14. Any guidance on VMV guide on legacy systems? For example, if there is a legacy system, then using the existing functions or functions to be improved or updated, then defines it's a way to define the requirements. So in that case, it's easier to start from the existing functions. But once again, I agree with Temi. It's a recursive activity.
If I'm a supplier and I'm reacting to a set of requirements from a customer, my process is start with a set of requirements. And then historically, then I have to do the requirements analysis to uncover what the functions are, the performance are, build my models, but it's based on that customer supplied set of requirements. So that can be kind of confusing this because theoretically, what the customer should have done is started with the problem statement and identify the stakeholders and do all the use cases, extract user stories, ops concepts, extracting the functions from that. Bruce, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, okay. So what I'm hearing is a lack of differentiation between the levels of the requirements within the architecture. Because if you do, as you just suggested, start with the user-centric view and start to put together a set of functions based on that, you end up with a top-level architecture. And then as you dig further into it, you use those functions to create new requirements at another level in the architecture, and those create additional requirements. So the only way that I see of saying that you start with the functions first is if you're jumping into the middle of an existing architecture.
Francisco, you had your hand raised?
Yes, thank you very much. I think this is a key question. There is not a single answer in my understanding. I would also suggest to improve the terminology or to standardize the terminology. Because, for instance, in my word, use cases are used to derive system requirements, certainly not user requirements or business requirements. It would be nice to standardize, for instance, all this terminology like use cases, user needs, business cases, business scenarios, and so forth, and to link this to the different levels of requirements. I can also imagine that there is not a single answer, like first you do one thing and then the other, but it really depends on the organization, on the agreements, on the contractual agreements, on the partners and the relationship between the involved partners. So I can imagine that sometimes you start a project, so you have certain constraints and certain requirements at the project level, and then within the project, you develop a system, but sometimes you have to perform before business analysis, before even starting a project to get the funds and to clean the scope of the project. So I experienced many different situations where the answer to this question was different.
Before I comment, Gary, you had your hand raised too.
My question on this, I agree with it's iterative. As you iterate through, you may create more and more different components. But the one thing that, for consistency's sake, the one thing that hangs me up a little bit is, like, I don't think you always need a use case, don't always need a diagram for something. What things are required that should probably always be there for consistency's sake, because it seems to me that you'd want a consistent way of doing this. So for instance, you always have written requirements, perhaps, and maybe you always have a written need statement, which may be somewhat mandatory, but then maybe the other things are optional. That's where I would like to better understand which ones you think are mandatory and which ones are optional.
This diagram I just put up, recognize that we have various levels. The first two levels I show here, level 0 and 1, are organizational levels. So we have the organization strategic level and then the business operations level. And so you have the business requirements and business operations requirements. And these operation requirements in the 15288 are called the stakeholder needs and requirements instead of business operations requirements. And those are defined as part of initiating a project. And at that level, they make a decision. Are we going to do something in-house? Are we going to contract the work out? And then those set of requirements then flow down to the next level. So level 2, I show here the product or system requirements level, all those inputs, the stakeholder needs and requirements. Like I say, there's multiple stakeholders. We need to find different methods of eliciting the needs and requirements from the stakeholders stakeholders. And there's a variety of different methods doing that. And use cases is one of those. Ops concepts, operation scenarios, user stories. Depending on what domain you're in, you may favor one methodology of extracting this information from the stakeholders from another. But then we also have drivers constraints. The upper level will have defined a mission statement, goals and objectives, measures that they expect the project to adhere to. There's risks that we have to talk about. So then the project needs to distill all this information and figure out, do we have a feasible concept for actually dealing with all these needs requirements within the driver's constraints and the risks that have been defined. And so there's a lot of churn that should take place up front, developing lifecycle concepts for not only the system, but also for how we're going to manage the project, how we're going to do systems engineering, and the project's going to reflect all that in different documents. So there's a lot of concurrent stuff going on. And then one thing that's always been troubling for me is in the guide for writing requirements, we always say that a key characteristic of our needs and requirements is they're feasible. But in reality, to me, feasibility is in the physical world, the maturity of technologies to be able to get a certain level of performance that's expected. So we need to come up with a concept for how we're actually going to architect and design the system, at least in a preliminary fashion, so we can identify critical technologies so that we can assess their maturity and then come up with a technology maturation plan for whichever candidate technologies we think have reasonable amount of risk we can implement. And all that needs to be done before we baseline a set of needs, because the needs are supposed to be feasible. So we don't want to ask for something that's not feasible. And that's the needs then are transformed into the set of what we call design input requirements that are inputs to the design process. And then at the system level, those requirements then will flow down to the next level of the architecture. And then each piece of the architecture, the subsystem, system elements, the next level, then, as you can see, go through the same process. For a project team, whatever piece of the architecture that they're responsible for, that's their system of interest. And so they need to go through this process to adequately define their system of interest, no matter what level their system of interest exists. And if I'm a customer, I should be doing this area in pink, then lifecycle concept needs. I should be doing this work before I actually baseline design input requirements that I'm going to put in a contract. Now, there are some organizations that are looking at maybe what we put in the contract is the integrated set of needs and let the supplier develop the system requirements. And I've seen some military programs do that where they're buying a service instead of buying an actual spacecraft or something. As long as the service meets their needs, then they're happy. And maybe the service is satellite communication. So they just buy the communications capability from someone, they're not buying a satellite. And that's a different way of looking at things also. But I like what one of the people said, there's no one way of doing this. We have to realize that one size doesn't fit all. And so we have to tailor everything that's in the manual to our specific domains, product lines, and processes and culture within our company. Any comments? Okay, Carlo gave me a thumbs up. Thank you. The answer to 11, in my perspective, is that we need to understand the underlying analysis from which the requirements came from. And if we're really doing a true MBSE model-based approach, we would have started the models as part of our needs definition, lifecycle concept analysis based on our elicitation activities from the stakeholders. And then that underlying analysis forms a basis for which our needs were defined on. But then we can just continue those models and refine them to then define the requirements. And then once we have a set of requirements, then we go into what's called model-based design that starts with the requirements, and we can come up with a design. But the models are being used throughout the life cycle. They're just getting more mature, more detailed. They become more white box than black box. And so then we can start running simulations as part of our design activities. The one question here, I was still accepting inputs, and that was back in August when we first submitted the manuals. And at that time we were. Now we're to the point where we've gotten all the inputs that we can handle at this time. Our intent of releasing the manual now is then we'll get it out into the community. I know a lot of people already have access to the manual and are using the manual in their organizations. Hopefully we'll have a broader audience, and whatever feedback we get from the manual, that'll feed back into the manual next revision.
So I'm speaking as a new user. Where do I find the manual?
As a new member of the Requirements Working Group, are you aware that there's really two different websites?
No.
Tammy will show you how to get to the Requirement Working Group Connect site and also Yammer for communications. We keep all of our files on the Connect site for collaboration, and she'll give a demo on that. I show it's 350 already. I guess we're not going to be able to finish these questions. So I'll address 12 real quick. The lessons of practice in the Guide to Applicable Government Acquisition Programs. I would say definitely the manual doesn't use all the language that you would find in a government acquisition. There is operational test and evaluation, developmental test and evaluation terminology, but in general, it follows the life cycles that are defined in the System Engineering Handbook. I'm going to jump to 14. One thing about legacy systems in the manual, we make the differentiation between Greenfield systems and Brownfield systems, where Greenfield is we're starting from a blank piece of paper from scratch, and Brownfield systems are the legacy systems that we're going to build upon, improve in a new revision of the legacy systems. And so both perspectives are talked about. As far as the V&V application, that's another topic that we'll have to get into. So why don't we go ahead and switch over to Tammy?
Okay, excellent. For most of the members, this is a platform for you as a good starting point. You're going to want to go ahead and bookmark this at some point. You notice I've got a bookmark here. And when I got on the Requirement Working Group site, I bookmarked it as well. So what I did is I log in and I hit the collaboration portal, and they call it Connect. But if any of you are familiar with the application SharePoint, ultimately it's a SharePoint site. And when you click on this, you're going to have an opportunity to click on working groups and then find requirements. And that's up here. And then when you click on this, there's a list and you can see requirements. And there it is. And when you get on there, if you have any access problems, it probably means you did not log into your INCOSE account first, because it uses that account to grant permissions. So just go in and start from INCOSE, make sure you're logged in to your account, and this should work for you. And if not, you're going to want to email CIO@incose.org. That is our Chief Information Officer, Barclay Brown, who could probably give you a hand with any permission issues. Once you get on there, you get to the Requirements Working Group. This is our homepage, and I would actually advise you to go ahead and bookmark it too. But you can see here on the left side, there's a series of tabs you can go to, including our manual, our two guides, which are drafts right now, and general meetings. And those are the most useful areas I think you can go to. If you click on this, you're going to get to a SharePoint site where Lou has uploaded the manual, and you can go ahead and download a copy. Likewise with the guides. And on general meetings, you're actually going to go see our upcoming meetings and then past meetings, including any slides, videos, recordings, additional material. So if you missed our meeting in November, for example, there's a lot of links here for you. Now, one thing I did want to let you know is starting last February, we started to use YouTube. We created a YouTube account for the INCOSE Requirement Working Group. And this will actually take you to the YouTube when you see these recording links. But you can also go to YouTube and do a search for INCOSE Requirement Working Group. And then you'll get to this site, and we've got a homepage and we've got playlists. And we've been posting things like our Exchange Cafe recording, our guest speakers, various other meetings we had, like our IW sessions last year, all on this site. So this is a good resource. This is open. You don't have to be an INCOSE member to see this material. We like to keep our information out there for folks for good requirement practices, but you do have to be a member to see this material. The last thing I want to do is highlight our Yammer site and our team site. And I saw that one of our comments was, hey, if I'm on a company site, I can't seem to log in with my INCOSE account. That is very common. So what we do is if you have the app, and you can keep your app on one login, and then you can go on your internet browser, and I Google in login for Microsoft Teams. And once you log in, you can get your INCOSE Teams account that you get with your membership, and you can actually use this Teams web version. And when you do that, whatever team you're a member of could show up here in your INCOSE login. But on these three dots is communities. That's Yammer. And we've been adding people to Yammer. So if you're not on there yet, again, alert the CIO. He's trying to add everybody as quickly as possible. You can go to communities, and you can go all communities. And you can actually find us here and join us. You hit the join community button. So even if you haven't joined our community, you can go ahead and actively join it if you weren't already added to it. And when you go to our site here, we've pinned in again our Connect site and our YouTube channel here as well. There's links, there's general information, and we're trying to encourage our members to go ahead and use this as an interactive forum. Post questions. If we didn't address some of your questions in an Exchange Cafe, because 1 hour once a month may not be enough, this is our opportunity to talk to each other all throughout the year at any time, at any time zone. So we really appreciate it if people would go ahead and do things like ask a question, and we can go ahead and have our various members respond and form a dialogue. We also post when we're going to have events and links to material as well on this platform, but this is more of an interactive platform, hence it's called a community. Okay, Lou, that's pretty much the material I wanted to make sure I covered. Is there any other questions before we depart for today?
One more. You described how to get to Yammer through Microsoft Teams, but what if we're not yet on INCOSE Teams? How do we get started with Microsoft Teams INCOSE?
Every member is getting a Teams account, and I guess with thousands of members, it might take time to get everybody their account. But once they have their account, they are notified by the Chief Information Officer of their login. They get an email from Barclay Brown that says, here's your login to Teams. I don't know the pace that he's got everyone added, but that is something that they've been working on actively this last year.
Okay, so I should just wait for my notice.
You could wait, or you could email him.
CIO at INCOSE.
Yeah, INCOSE.net.
And one thing to note that going through Teams is one way of doing it on a laptop or on a desktop computer. But if you have I know from an Apple standpoint, my iPad or iPhone, they have separate apps for Teams and Yammer. And I found that I had to go in and log into Teams first and establish my Teams account. And once I did that, then I could go through and use the same login credentials to log into the Yammer application. I keep that on my iPad all the time. And if anybody submits a comment or something, then I'm notified right away that that happens. I've also found that email address they give you, your first name dot last name at INCOSE.org and at whatever it is, you set up your email program to receive emails at that address. And then whenever someone posts something to the Yammer page, if you ask for that in your preferences, you'll get an email of that posting without ever having to be in Yammer or Teams. So that's another way of being able to keep current and make sure you don't miss anything. The time is up. We're going to have 2 days in January that Tammy's going to set up for IW. And in between time, you try to get into Teams and Yammer. And if you haven't downloaded the materials, do so. Whenever we post a new version of the manual, we'll send out a notice to the membership. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording.